Breaking news today. Foreign reactions to the situations in Ukraine and Israel have been divisive. It's possible that the rest of the world doesn't agree with President Joe Biden's legislative and geopolitical tying of the Russia-Ukraine and Hamas-Israel wars. Vice President Joe Biden opened last week's address to the nation by saying, "We're facing an inflection point in history. One of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come." I agree with Biden. However, the international inflection may steer geopolitics in a different direction than the president intends because of how the developing world, increasingly known as the collective colloquialism, Global South, views the Middle East. Both rhetorically and politically, Biden's comparison of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine to that between Hamas and Israel was spot on. Hamas and Russian President Vladimir Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common: they want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. However, many people around the world now believe that Gaza is in imminent danger due to recent events and a flood of graphic media. The context of the nihilistic violence committed by Putin in Ukraine and Hamas in Israel runs the risk of being lost in this interpretation. As a result, the accusation that the United States has a double standard is gaining traction around the world. Richard Gowan, UN Director at the International Crisis Group, said that many or most observers in the Global South sympathize with the Palestinians, even if they were disgusted by Hamas atrocities. Some people may question why the United States cares less about a siege in Gaza than in Mariupol, despite the fact that both populations are under siege. So, while I think Biden's pitch to U.S. audiences was effective, I don't think his attempt to link Ukraine and Israel as victims of aggression will resonate with the rest of the world. In Europe as well, Gowan stated, countries that are broadly united in support of Ukraine are divided over the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So again, this U.S. message only works in parts of NATO and the EU, European Union. Associate Professor of Political Science at St. Olaf College Anthony Lott argued that the Ukraine-Israel connection must be understood in the context of American domestic politics. Lott, whose research focuses on national and international security policy, stated, "From a security perspective, this link does not work as neatly as the administration would hope. There is less enthusiasm among some European allies to provide Israel with unqualified support. While it can be tempting to group all countries in the Global South together, there is a conscious effort to break that link beyond the United States and its closest allies, such as the United Kingdom. The conflict between Israel and the occupied territories is seen by many people in the Global South as a growing humanitarian disaster." The Biden administration, which has placed a greater emphasis on delivering humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians, has no doubt seen images from cameras documenting the catastrophic conditions in Gaza. Nearly 80 aid trucks had passed through the Rafah crossing in Egypt by Friday, but that was crumbs that will not make a difference for the 2 million people in the Strip, Philippe Lazzarini, the head of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, said at a news conference. According to his report, Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 57 UNRWA employees. At the same time, the United Nations World Food Programme issued a dire warning: the catastrophic conditions facing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza risk getting worse still, due to severe fuel shortages which threaten to bring food and other humanitarian operations to a standstill. In a statement released on Friday, the Red Cross expressed relief that it had been able to send a war surgery team and a weapons contamination specialist into the country, but it also expressed concern that the humanitarian catastrophe is deepening by the hour. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, told Fox News on Thursday that his caucus does not want to bifurcate aid to Ukraine and Israel. Russia and China both want to see divisions emerge in Washington to weaken support for Ukraine and around the world to further their goal of isolating the West from the Global South. Russia has been making every effort to embarrass and isolate the U.S. over this crisis at the UN, Gowan said. On Thursday, Russian officials hosted Hamas representatives in Moscow, making the terrorist organization look like a legitimate political entity despite being responsible for the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But the cynicism of the Kremlin isn't localized just there. Similar calculations are made in other capitals in response to unrest on the streets. UN Envoy Gowan emphasized the need to remember that the Arab group of countries, and many non-Western countries of the UN, are not just playing a diplomatic game here, for or against a resolution. They are also having to respond to, in some cases, very, very angry domestic publics. And I think that the Arab group in particular, which is taking a very hard line in defense of the Palestinians, are aware that these images are spreading widely, being seen at home, and that has an effect on what their domestic audiences believe to be necessary. Its perceived hypocrisy between linking Ukraine to Israel-Gaza gets amplified by the scenes that are coming out of Gaza right now, in the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding, Lott said. That would be the consequence of the media coverage right now. Vice President Biden also discussed the power of visuals, but he seemed to focus on whether or not the international community would perceive the United States as being resolute. We know that our allies and, perhaps more importantly, our adversaries and competitors, are watching, Biden said, referring to the world beyond Europe. They are also monitoring our reaction. In the meantime, the United Nations is keeping a close eye on everything, particularly a troubled area. As Gowan summarized, everyone is trying to stop the potential for a regional conflict that would have global spillover effects. At the moment, everyone is trying to predict Israel's next move. There is widespread fear of escalation within the United Nations, but its members find it challenging to break out of their comfort zones and engage in concrete diplomatic initiatives to mitigate the threat. Everyone at the UN has very long-standing positions around the Middle East, and so what we're seeing at the moment is quite a lot of political theater around the UN, which I fear is not actually necessarily really stopping the risks of a spiral to something much, much worse. Biden used a phrase from Madeleine Albright, calling the United States the indispensable nation. This is especially important now, as the world is at a pivotal juncture.